Hello everyone, my name is Elisabeth Sommerlad. I am a postdoc at the Department of Geography at Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, Germany. And in my talk today, I will give you a little insight into my research project on intercultural spaces in feature films. This was my dissertation project, which I defended in 2019 and which will be published later this year as a book. My talk is entitled Cinematic New York as Intercultural Space, a film geographic perspective on staging intercultural encounters in feature films. An everyday and medially widespread topos of New York is that the city is the city of cultural diversity. Clayman and Lee, for example, state this as an apparent fact in their book Ethnicity, where they say New York City is possibly the most diverse city in the world. And countless other publications, media outlets, blogs, and so on share their opinion. From a media geographical perspective, one can assume that our ideas of New York are very much intertwined with such constructions of meaning. The particular relevance of feature films should be highlighted here for this talk, especially because they reflect culturally diverse lifestyles and conflicts in a highly complex way. There are already numerous interdisciplinary studies that question how feature films imagine individual cultural groups or stage aspects of cultural diversity. Still, there is a desideratum in the analysis of the social interaction between people who are portrayed as being culturally different. Jacobson, 2017, for example, argues for a critically thoughtful engagement with cinematic staging of intercultural issues. This is also the starting point of my film geographical study, from which I would like to present some selected aspects to you today. My talk follows the question of how feature films construct, stage, and convey intercultural encounters in the context of the cinematic city of New York. And I am particularly interested in the staging strategies. That's what I call recurring ways of constructing meaning across multiple movies. The theoretical basis of my work consists of three cornerstones. First, we have the foundation, which is formed by approaches from the research field of geographies of encounter, a field that is focusing on the micro perspective of interpersonal interactions in urban contexts. Cultural diversity is thereby seen as a quality that is only produced in the context of everyday encounters. Proceeding with an open concept of culture, I have investigated concepts of interculturality, cultural differentiation, and cultural diversity. By interculturality, I refer to the communicative exchange between persons who are regarded as belonging to different cultural backgrounds. For this perspective, it is important to assume that there are no culturally homogeneous units facing each other, but that we are looking at individual protagonists with diverse backgrounds of experience. When considering interculturality, one must always ponder on cultural diversity as well, and also on cultural differences, since both phenomena are social constructions that do not exist per se. Besides, it is very important to think about possible dimensions of cultural diversity, and in the context of my work, I did this for the USA. These theoretical fragments can be integrated into the conceptual framework of an intercultural space. And by an intercultural space, I understand an interpersonal communication space that describes an intercultural encounter situation in which different cultural positions are negotiated and aspects of cultural diversity are interactively constructed. These assumptions can be translated into a theoretical model, which we can read from down to the top. First, we have a place of encounter where actors come together and they interact with each other, of course. The involved protagonists practice cultural differentiation in this process, and aspects of cultural diversity can be negotiated. I want to highlight three specific characteristics of intercultural spaces here. First of all, I presume that encounters can always be located in one specific location that holds an intercultural potential. Secondly, the concept of the boundary and or the crossing of boundaries are core elements of such intercultural encounters, whereby I grasp a boundary as something that is processually constructed, that emerges in intercultural exchanges. And especially because different aspects of diversity are always negotiated depending on the context of the interaction partners, I further assume that intercultural spaces are subject to their own dynamics. I have in the next step modified this model a little bit for my studies, since I deal with cinematic intercultural spaces, which I understand as being medial constructions that can only be observed through the lens of movies. Consequently, cinematic encounter situations are always mediated constructions which are staged by the use of film-specific means of expression. Films, in this perspective, do not just replicate social life, but rather stage it in a processual way, reducing its complexity. In my study, I have compared key sequences from 17 feature films that you can see on this slide, which are dating from the year 1987 to 2015. I have limited the selection to contemporary, post-classical US-American films, which focus on everyday encounter situations. The analysis focuses on the repetitive ways in which intercultural encounters are staged. These stagings are the result of the multi-layered interplay between three elements, which are protagonists, the places of action, and film-specific construction elements. For cinematic New York, I was able thereby to identify 6 recurring dimensions of intercultural spaces, which I will present to you in the following slides. First of all, one should mention intercultural spaces of differentiating labeling. These are characterized by processes of mutual differentiation based on striking markings of sites and protagonists, for example, through physical characteristics, items of clothing, and accessories, just to name a few of them. In the interaction process, these items are emphasized as signs of cultural difference. Furthermore, we can find intercultural spaces of irritating communication. Here, differences become apparent in the actual performance of practices, for example, regarding the etiquette of people, the way of speaking, or eating habits. In intercultural spaces of multidimensional discrimination, focus is placed on the articulation of prejudices, stereotypes, and discriminatory attitudes. These 3 modes of staging are already based on processes of delimitation between interaction partners, and in the next intercultural space, which I named intercultural spaces of restrictive boundary drawing, this aspect finds very specific expression. If boundaries are not maintained in the movies, spaces of impossible boundary crossing unfold. And finally, there is an antidote to this when we regard intercultural spaces of enabling boundary commuting. It is important to say that in movies, those spaces overlap all the time. They intersect, and there's an interplay that we can focus on, meaning that in a single sequence, several spaces can exist simultaneously. I now want to illustrate the staging of intercultural spaces with a presentation of 3 facets when I focus on intercultural spaces of boundary drawing, boundary crossing, and boundary commuting. In intercultural spaces of restrictive boundary drawing, the motive of the boundary explicitly becomes the focus of the interaction in the sequence. In many cases, the protagonists point out that their capacity for action is limited on the basis of culturally relevant aspects, and a very good example for this are social manners. For example, the Jewish ultra-Orthodox characters Rivka in the movie New York, I Love You, Rochel in Arranged, or even Abigail in the movie Fading Gigolo, they all reject shaking hands with their counterparts, adopting a phrase such as, and I quote, "I don't shake hands, it is not allowed," unquote. And in the movie The Namesake, Nikhil explains to his girlfriend Maxine that when she first encounters his Bengali parents that she has to follow some rules of conduct. And he describes this in detail when he says, "No kissing, no holding hands. My parents are not Lydia and Gerald." Such limitations can also be formulated in terms of normative dietary rules, but they all have in common that the scope of action is restricted. But, on the other hand, it is also prevented that conflicting boundaries are crossed. These, on the other hand, become apparent in spaces of impossible boundary crossing. Cultural differences are thereby turned into non-negotiable facts. This evokes dysfunctional, impossible communication, encounters are interrupted, and relationships fail. In the further course of the sequence that I just quoted from The Namesake, this dimension of social boundary crossing initially becomes evident when Maxine greets Ashima, Nikhil's mother, with a kiss on the cheek and tries again and again to tenderly touch her boyfriend through the sequence. She ignores the rules of conduct that Nikhil has been explaining to her and crosses communicative boundaries. Such situations contribute in the end to the breakup of the relationship of Maxine and Nikhil. Another motive is the crossing of topographical boundaries. Films repeatedly address the aspect that in New York there are ethnic neighborhoods separated by certain streets. A very good example is Canal Street in the movie China Girl, which is drawn as a non-negotiable demarcation line. Any transgression leads to gang fights and ultimately to the death of the main characters. In other movies, the crossing of such lines leads not to death, but to physical collisions like, for example, car accidents. They are often accentuated by comments like this quote from the movie Brooklyn Babylon, where Scratch says, "Hey, you shouldn't be on the side, man. That's a dividing line right here. You know the rules. You stay on your fucking side. We stay on our side." Furthermore, transgressions of boundaries manifest as attempts to recode ethnically coded sites. This is dealt with in a particularly complex way in the famous movie Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee. A number of settings in the movies are presented in which some such symbolic metaphorical markings are challenged. For example, Radio Rahim on the right side of the slide frequently tags his neighborhood with noisy music resounding from a ghetto blaster, and Stevie on the left side duels him with Latin American salsa music aiming to shift power towards the Puerto Rican community. In my last example, cultural boundaries are interpreted as flexible boundaries, areas that can be temporarily transcended. In this case, boundary crossings are tied to a certain person that is crossing the boundaries. That is, to a figure who is able to move in a certain boundary area. An instance of this are individual adjustment strategies for bridging differences. For example, in Arranged, Nazira ties her hijab as a tissue so as not to be noticed as a Muslim in a Jewish ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. Another variation is revealed in personifications and metaphorical illusions of interculturality. On the one hand, there are personified boundary commuters who embody cultural diversity, so to say. One of these is again Ashima Ganguly in the movie The Namesake, who seems to have this quality already inscribed in her own name. We can learn from the movie that Ashima means without borders, limitless, for example. Some movies also create metaphorical illusions of cultural diversity. For example, in the movie New York, I Love You, we can find a sequence where the Jewish ultra-Orthodox Rivka, in a dream sequence, imagines the diamond dealer Mansuk Bai as her husband, and she appears to him in return as a reflection, where she's dressed like a Bollywood lady. They form a Bollywood couple, and they are, at least in his illusion, united across any cultural differences. By comparing the three examples, it becomes very clear that in all dimensions, the motive of the cultural boundary is in focus, regardless of whether boundaries are of a material, symbolic, or communicative kind. This becomes particularly clear at the moment of drawing the boundary. But what I find even more interesting is the further handling of those boundaries within intercultural encounters. On the one hand, there is an intercultural coexistence. Here, processes of differentiation lead to an emphasizing of cultural differences, and processes of delimitation, misunderstandings, and confrontations arise, mostly with regards to aspects of ethnicity, race, and religion. On the other hand, in spaces of enabling boundary commuting, which can also be called intercultural spaces of togetherness, cultural junctions are created. New potentials for action can emerge, from which new visions of living together arise. In feature films, coexistence and togetherness virtually form a continuum, even if one can observe that we have a dominance of spaces of coexistence. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize 3 key points that I believe are key to staging intercultural encounters in feature films. Firstly, the staging of everyday encounters focuses on processes of differentiation, in the context of which people stress cultural differences, often with reference to essentializing and racializing markers. Secondly, intercultural encounters are dominated by mutual, social, as well as local processes of demarcation and the drawing of boundaries. Boundaries declared to be cultural are often presented as fragile lines of conflict in the movies. And the continuous marking, crossing, and balancing of boundaries results in that intercultural encounters usually function solely through coexistence. Intercultural togetherness is often tied to the occasional individual willingness of individual protagonists to adjust to a situation. In addition, movies can also create metaphorical illusions of togetherness through the usage of cinematographic aesthetics. However, these can often be deconstructed as utopian moments. And with these findings, I would like now to turn to the opening of my presentation. The examined movies display New York quite clearly as a culturally heterogeneous city, but at the same time they disenchant the medially widespread urban myth of New York City being a harmonious, culturally diverse metropolis. The staging strategies condense into something that Goldschmidt, for the everyday world of New York, calls geography of difference. Hence, New York City is projected as a cinematic city of tolerated cultural coexistence. It's a city in which cultural differences are an integral part of urban culture, comprehensively permeating the way of life of the staged urban society. By this, I close, and I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking very much forward to your questions, to your remarks in the discussion panel.